Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
We need to get to a climate of long-termism in British industry. I came out of British industry from a company where we engaged in 25-year planning. It's not in the nature of capitalism to be short-term. It's the way that our policy has been conducted.
That was 1997, Liberal Democrat Vince Cable giving his maiden speech to Parliament, decrying short-termism in politics. One might say little has changed. With a huge cohort of fresh Lib Dems in Parliament, what does he think the role of the party should be now? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. That impassioned speech went on to make the case for Bank of England independence only months before it was announced. He points out the direct relationship between interest rates and the rising cost of national borrowing. Well, 26 years later, it's an issue with clear parallels today as Chancellor Rachel Reeves struggles with a national debt which now stands at £2.7 trillion.
The difference now is that Liberal Democrats have a bigger influence, one might argue, with 72 seats in Parliament in Westminster versus 46 back in 97. But Cable is still a rarity, a Lib Dem with experience in government. He served, of course, as Business Secretary 2010 to 2015. He's got lots of hats now. Currently Vice President of the European Movement, an independent all-party pressure group. And, of course, he's an economist, famously predicted the economic crash of '08.
Well, 2 days before the Lib Dems kick-off party conference season, we're joined by Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats and former Business Secretary in the coalition government. Now, Sir Vince, a lot of people are talking about us entering another period of austerity. Some people are calling it Austerity 2.0. Do you think there's some truth in that?
I think there's a great deal of truth in it. There are a lot of parallels between the current situation and 2010. In both cases, government had to pile up very large stock of government debt and running large deficits as a result of a major shock. In that case, it was the collapse of the banking system, the financial crisis, and latterly we've had COVID and the Ukraine war and the cost of living crisis. And both incoming governments, the coalition and now Labour, have inherited this problem. We don't need to make party points about their predecessors being, at fault for it. The financial crisis was not the fault of Gordon Brown. There were things that could have been done, but it wasn't their fault in a tribal sense. And equally, I wouldn't, you don't blame the Conservative government for the fact we had COVID. But the incoming governments have inherited this serious problem, and it's not easily sustainable. And Britain these days is dependent on, I think, what Mark Carney the kindness of strangers. And we've discovered in recent years the power of the bond market vigilantes, and any government's got to be aware of that. Yeah. And therefore, we are going to be in a period of austerity, if by austerity you mean public sector discipline.
Yeah. And, of course, the difference being, in 25 years that the kindness of strangers has actually increased significantly for the UK. What do you expect from the budget then? Because the Labour Party has talked about, not wanting to be short-termist, wanting to be in power perhaps for 2 terms, a 10-year plan, a long-term plan. What's going to happen in the budget? Tax hikes and cuts?
Yeah, there will have to be substantial increases in taxes. I think the issue will be whether it's just confined to a narrow band of capital taxation of the kind that have already been promised, or whether it's wider. Not too many people are talking about road fuel tax, which is a kind of obvious big bang type of revenue measure, and I suspect we may see that. I think the government created a problem for itself in the run-up to the election in order not to frighten voters. They didn't want to talk about tax, and as a result they have a relatively poor mandate for implementing what will almost certainly be difficult measures. And the fact that we don't have an honest conversation about taxation, how do we have European levels of services and Americans' level of tax? This sort of basic conundrum at the heart of British politics has never been confronted, and we're particularly vulnerable now for the fact that it's not being openly debated.
What lessons can Labour learn from Austerity 1.0? Are there things that you regret about what the government did to public spending and taxation during those years?
Well, I think we had vigorous internal debates during the coalition years. I was very much at the heart of them. I think one of the big mistakes was to have approached public spending in an undifferentiated way. And we cut infrastructure. There was no good reason for that. It was just easier. The Treasury hates capital investment by government. And I think quite a bit of damage was done to housing, particularly social housing, infrastructure investment in general. And I would hope that they, but maybe by redefining the debt rule, find a way of separating out infrastructure investment, public investment, and maintaining a steady tempo of that. That would be one of my key points. And I think the second is the balance between taxation and public spending has to be different. I mean, in the coalition, we overwhelmingly relied on cutting spending rather than higher taxes. There were some higher taxes, but not much. And that balance probably now has to switch to 50-50 or maybe predominantly taxation.
Yeah, that's really difficult, though. I mean, what are the avenues do you think that Rachel Reeves is going to try and go down? Because, already cutting £200 or £300 in terms of the winter fuel subsidy has caused a major issue for the government. OK, they passed it easily in Parliament. Still, 53 abstained of their own MPs. And then you have the wealth taxes. I mean, already in the City of London, within our kind of particular remit, the concerns around non-doms, around kind of, I suppose I'll call them wealth creators, leaving the UK, there's a real issue if you increase capital gains tax and those sorts of taxes.
Well, the winter fuel allowance was a bit of an own goal, and I think it stemmed from a certain naivety. I think officials just plonked a long list of things that they plunk in front of all ministers and said, "Oh, Minister, this is an easy one. Why don't you just cut it?" And she rose to the bait wrongly. I mean, I made mistakes like that when I first got into government. You're presented with long lists of things to cut, and you're not quite sure what they are, and you make mistakes. And I think she did that.
Really? I mean, how could you not know what the £300 pensioner subsidy is, that it's not going to make the front pages?
Well, it probably was intended to make the front pages in a somewhat different... There was a more elegant and easier way of doing it, which was to simply tax the benefit. And it would have hit the high-income groups, but not quite with all the tapering problems at the bottom end, which is what's caused all the grief. And the government, I don't think, has really made the case terribly well. I mean, the fact is that thanks to the triple lock, there's been quite a substantial boost to pensions this year, which more than offset the winter fuel allowance. But that case wasn't, I think, very effectively made.
I want to move on to talk about Lib Dem strategy. I dare say the party will be in buoyant form this weekend, all those new MPs. But isn't the electoral strategy ahead quite tricky for the Lib Dems? After the Tory wipeout in 97, the party successfully pivoted to targeting Labour seats. But that's something that's going to be much more difficult, isn't it? Because Labour-facing seats are just not competitive, are they, for the Lib Dems? Where does the party move?
No, that's quite right. I mean, the first priority will be to consolidate the base that's already built up. And, these are relatively high income, south of England, suburban, rural. I mean, it's a very clear constituency. It's not undifferentiated, but this is not, as it were, not natural centre-left territory. But what Lib Dems are very good at is digging in, doing extremely good local campaigning, constituency work. And I would think that unless there's some terrible misfortune, they should be able to hold on to the overwhelming bulk of these by the next election. But the Lib Dems' fortunes, in large part, I think, depend on what happens to the two major parties. I mean, the Conservative Party, if they make a bad choice of leaders, if they continue to behave the way they have in recent years, is going to continue to flounder. They lose support to us in their heartlands, and they could make no progress on the other front because Reform is gobbling up the populist, nationalist vote. And the Tory party could find itself in a kind of existential crisis. I mean, we don't know, but that could well happen. Then in terms of Labour, they are clearly already losing support, and they're going to lose support in the 400-plus seats that they won at the last election. But the question then is, where will it go? I mean, will it go to Reform if they get better organised? Nigel Farage is a good TV personality, but clearly not an organisational genius. Or could it go to the dissident left, the reborn Corbynites, or the Green Party?
Okay. But hang on a second. Let's cut through this a little bit and say, is there appetite in the Liberal Democrats for leadership? Because there was a glimmer of it in the election campaign. Is there now?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think the mantra, which is a good mantra, is constructive opposition. I don't think we just want to go around, cashing in on every drift in the public mood. Want to show that we can be a force in Parliament, and as I say, building on the base that we've already got. It's difficult to be a leader when you're 70 MPs. I mean, it was extremely difficult to offer leadership when we had 11 when I was the leader, but we had an issue then, which was Brexit. Now, there isn't obviously a big issue for the Lib Dems to focus on. I mean, we've got issues like, the sewage system, which captured people's imagination. Ed Davey has made care and the whole interconnected issues around social care and health a big issue. And if we are able to develop those, then there is sort of issue-based leadership, but it's difficult to sort of lead the country from the base that we're at.
So then are you going for government then?
Well, I think it must be the ambition of any serious party to play a role in government. I mean, we're a big party in local government, and I think one of the big changes in this Parliament would be that the Lib Dems return to government in the big cities of the north, which we once ran very well: Newcastle, Liverpool, Sheffield, and the rest. We already do Hull. In the same way that we run local government in large areas in the south of England. So government is not something we're afraid of. I mean, our people are very good at running cities and county governments and doing the compromises and the practicalities that you need in government. So I think aiming for government is not something we're afraid of. People, we had a bad experience in the coalition politically, but I mean that government was in many ways a very good government, and we're proud to be associated with it.
I want to pick up on something you said earlier about the breadth of the Lib Dem seats. Very much the Liberal Democrats now represent well-to-do people, mostly in the south of England. Is that a problem? The days of it being a national party seem to be behind it.
No, I don't think that's necessarily true. You're right that there are parts of the country where we don't have strong representation in Parliament. The north of England, we have a strong base in Scotland still, but we're weak in the north of England and Wales. It was said a few months ago that we permanently lost our strong base in the southwest of England, but that has come back, and I think we can do that in other parts of the country, and the way it will come back is through local government.
You are currently the Vice President of the European Movement. We spoke to Ed Davey during the campaign, who said that his aim was to improve the relationship with the EU slowly. Given the political realities, could and should that be moved forward? Should that be a bigger part of your thinking?
Well, my view is that the Lib Dems have a big opportunity here because although the Labour Party, certainly Keir Starmer and his group were very committed to the European Union, were strong Remainers, they're being extremely cautious to the point of weakness in even small openings. I mean, we've seen the way that Starmer threw back in the face of Chancellor Scholz the idea of the limited mobility scheme for young people, I mean, which was just a friendly gesture, and it was thrown away because some people somewhere might have conceivably interpreted this as free movement, which it wasn't. And the rejection of the Erasmus scheme. I mean, there are small initiatives that could have rebuilt relationships with the European Union, and this government has walked away from them. So there is a great opportunity for the Lib Dems, as the only unambiguously pro-European party, to push the envelope.
Keir Starmer says that Britain will not rejoin the EU in his lifetime. Do you think he's right?
No, I don't. I think within his lifetime, which may well be well into his 80s, I think it's a normal lifespan. I think it's very likely we will be back in a relationship with the European Union. But the European Union will be a different animal. I mean, it will have Ukraine as a member and other countries from the Balkans, for example, it will almost certainly have to have a looser, more flexible arrangement, what used to be called variable geometry, and I've thought that would have suited the British perfectly. And so having a relationship which reconnects us with the single market and the customs union seems to me very feasible within a decade.
My last thought for you is on America. We've been covering the Harris-Trump debate just this week and the presidential election in the US. It's a coin toss at the moment who's going to be in the White House. And yet the UK is closer and closer to the US, certainly in business terms and economic terms. How is the government going to deal with that relationship? How is Britain going to do that? It's also foundational to our economic growth prospects.
I think it's very worrying. I think it's one of the many consequences of Brexit that having lost our close relationship with our neighbours, we've fallen back on what used to be called a special relationship. It was certainly special to Britain, if not to the United States. And many things that, it's certainly in the foreign policy area, are now effectively driven by what happens in Washington. I mean, relations with China are a very good example of that. So we've become very highly dependent on the right kind of American president, and certainly a kind of collegiate, alliance-based democratic administration would probably suit the British government very well. But if the other happens, and if I were a gambling man, I would probably still have money on Trump. Things get very, very uncomfortable because he wants not just to blow up the relationship we built up to try and protect Ukraine, but in going into a much more protectionist world trade environment, breaking alliances left, right and centre. I mean, that could be a very chaotic world. The British government is now very exposed in.
Vince Cable, thank you so much for being with us, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, former business secretary. Thank you for your time. Of course, going up to the Lib Dem conference in Brighton this weekend. Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and Saksha Menezes, and our audio engineer was Sean Grastamakia and Caroline Hepker. And I'm Yuan Potts. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.